The afternoon light filtered through the oak trees lining my street in Clarksville, casting dappled shadows across the front porch of my craftsman home. I had just returned from another follow-up appointment at the hospital, my body still tender from the surgical incisions that hadn't healed as quickly as the doctors had hoped. The complications from what should have been a routine gallbladder removal had left me weak, dependent on James for even the simplest tasks. As I carefully stepped out of the car, gripping the door frame for support, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Victoria's silver SUV was parked in my driveway, taking up the space where I usually kept my own vehicle. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The front door of my home stood wide open, and I could hear voices inside, loud and careless, as if the occupants had every right to be there. My hands trembled as I reached for my keys, though I shouldn't have needed them with the door already ajar. Every careful restoration I had poured into this house over the past 5 years, every weekend spent refinishing the hardwood floors and carefully selecting period-appropriate fixtures, suddenly felt vulnerable. This wasn't just a house. It was the manifestation of my independence, the place where I had built my consulting business from nothing, where I had created a sanctuary of order and peace in a world that often felt chaotic. I took a slow breath, trying to steady myself against the wave of dizziness that threatened to overwhelm me. The pain medication made everything feel slightly unreal, as if I were moving through water. But the voices inside were sharp and clear, cutting through the fog with unmistakable clarity. Victoria's laugh echoed from somewhere deep in the house, that particular tone she used when she felt superior, when she wanted everyone around her to know she was in control. My stomach twisted, and for a moment I considered turning around, getting back in the car, and asking James to handle whatever was happening inside. But this was my home. I had fought too hard for it to surrender it without understanding what was happening. The house felt different the moment I crossed the threshold. The familiar scent of the lavender sachets I kept in the entryway had been replaced by something sharper, the smell of takeout food and perfume that wasn't mine. I moved slowly down the hallway, one hand trailing along the wall for support, my surgical wounds pulling with each step. The hardwood floors that I had spent months refinishing gleamed under the afternoon sun streaming through the windows, but there were scuff marks now, dark streaks that hadn't been there this morning when James had helped me into the car for my appointment. In the living room I found them. Victoria had made herself comfortable on my vintage settee, the one I had discovered at an estate sale and had carefully reupholstered in dove gray linen. Her shoes were kicked off carelessly on the floor, and she was scrolling through her phone with the kind of relaxed posture that suggested she had been there for hours. Her daughter Sophie was sprawling across my reading chair, tablet in hand, while Ethan had commandeered the entire sofa. His long teenage limbs stretched out as he played a video game on the television I used for occasional evening movies. Victoria looked up as I entered, and her expression shifted from surprise to something harder, more defensive. For a brief moment, neither of us spoke. I took in the scene more fully now, the coffee cups leaving rings on my refinished side table, the scattered magazines that weren't mine, the laptop case I didn't recognize sitting on the floor near the bookshelf. Margaret, Victoria's mother and my mother-in-law, emerged from the kitchen carrying a plate of cookies, stopping short when she saw me standing in the doorway. The silence stretched between us, thick and uncomfortable. I had known Victoria for 6 years, ever since James and I had started dating. Our relationship had always been cordial if not warm, marked by the kind of polite distance that often exists between in-laws who don't quite know how to connect. But there had never been open hostility, never this sense of territorial claim that I was now feeling radiating from every corner of my own living room. Margaret recovered first, setting down the plate and offering me a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. She asked how I was feeling, her tone carefully neutral, as if she hadn't just made herself at home in my kitchen without invitation. I opened my mouth to respond, but Victoria cut in before I could form the words. She said something about how they had been worried about me being alone all day, how they thought it would be nice to keep the house lively while I was recovering. The explanation sounded reasonable on the surface, almost thoughtful. But there was something in Victoria's voice that set my teeth on edge, an undercurrent of ownership that didn't match the words. I glanced around the room again, noting details I had missed in my initial shock. The throw pillows I had carefully arranged on the settee were tossed aside, replaced by Victoria's oversized purse and a shopping bag from an expensive boutique downtown. The vintage photograph I kept on the mantel, a black and white image of the house from the 1920s, had been moved to make room for Victoria's collection of coffee cups. I forced myself to speak calmly, thanking them for their concern but explaining that I was actually quite tired and needed to rest. The words came out more weakly than I had intended, my voice still rough from the anesthesia that had lingered in my system for days after the surgery. Victoria waved a dismissive hand, assuring me that they would be quiet, that I should go ahead and lie down while they took care of things downstairs. The presumption in her tone was unmistakable. She wasn't offering to help. She was informing me of what would happen in my own home. Something shifted in that moment. Despite the exhaustion weighing down my limbs, despite the persistent ache in my abdomen where the surgeons had cut into me, I felt a spark of resistance flare to life. I had spent too many years building my independence, creating a life where I answered to no one but myself, to simply accept this casual takeover of my space. But I was also acutely aware of my vulnerability. In my current state, I couldn't physically remove them. I couldn't stand here and argue without risking a setback in my recovery. So I did the only thing I could do in that moment. I nodded slowly, as if accepting her pronouncement, and turned toward the stairs. Each step upward required concentration, my hand gripping the banister that James and I had stripped and refinished together during our first year in the house. Behind me, I could hear Victoria's voice resume its normal volume, speaking to Margaret about plans for dinner, discussing whether they should order pizza or cook something from my kitchen. My bedroom felt like a refuge when I finally reached it, closing the door behind me with a soft click. I sank onto the edge of the bed, my whole body trembling from the exertion of climbing the stairs and the surge of adrenaline that had carried me through the confrontation downstairs. The room was exactly as I had left it this morning, the bed carefully made, my book still open on the nightstand, the curtains drawn back to let in the afternoon light. This at least they hadn't touched. I reached for my phone, intending to call James, to ask him what was happening and why his family had taken over our home without warning. But as my fingers hovered over his contact, I hesitated. James had been under enormous pressure at work lately, pulling long hours to close a deal that could make or break his career. He had been attentive during my recovery, taking time off for my surgery and the first few difficult days afterward, but I had seen the stress in his eyes, the way his jaw tightened when his phone rang with yet another work emergency. The last thing he needed was to be pulled into a family drama. I set the phone down and lay back against the pillows, staring at the ceiling fan that turned slowly overhead. The voices from downstairs drifted up through the floorboards, muffled but persistent. I could hear Sophie laughing at something on her tablet, Ethan's game emitting tinny explosions and victory music, Victoria and Margaret's conversation flowing easily as they moved between the living room and kitchen. They sounded comfortable, settled, as if this had been the plan all along. My mind drifted back to the early days of my relationship with James, when I had first met his family. Victoria had been friendly enough then, asking polite questions about my work and complimenting my dress at our first family dinner. But there had always been an edge of assessment in her gaze, as if she were cataloging my worth and finding it just slightly insufficient. She had her own life in Dallas, a seemingly perfect existence with Derek and their 2 children, living in a sprawling suburban home with a pool and a 3-car garage. James had told me once, during one of our late-night conversations when we were first falling in love, that Victoria had always been the golden child of the family. She had married. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Produced beautiful children, maintained the kind of lifestyle that Margaret could brag about to her friends. He, on the other hand, had chosen a more unconventional path, building his career slowly and deliberately rather than chasing immediate success. Our modest craftsman home in Austin, with its vintage charm and careful restorations, couldn't compete with Victoria's showcase property in the suburbs of Dallas. I hadn't cared about any of that. What mattered to me was the life James and I were building together, the quiet satisfaction of creating something authentic, rather than impressive. My consulting business had grown steadily over the years, allowing me to work from home and maintain the flexibility I valued. I had clients across the country, managing their financial portfolios and investment strategies from my converted sunroom office. The work was demanding but rewarding, and it had given me the financial independence I had always craved. That independence felt fragile now, lying in bed while strangers, even if they were family, occupied my space downstairs. I closed my eyes, trying to will away the anxiety that was building in my chest. The doctors had warned me about stress during recovery, about the importance of rest and calm. But how was I supposed to rest when every instinct was screaming at me that something was very wrong? The afternoon wore on, the light shifting gradually across the bedroom walls as the sun moved toward the horizon. I must have dozed at some point, because when I opened my eyes again, the room was dimmer, filled with the golden glow of early evening. The voices downstairs had multiplied. I could hear Derek now, his deep baritone adding to the chorus, and what sounded like James home earlier than expected. I sat up carefully, testing my body's response. The pain was still there, a constant reminder of the trauma my system had endured, but it was manageable. I stood slowly, smoothing down my clothes and running a hand through my hair. Whatever was happening downstairs, I needed to understand it. I needed to talk to James and figure out why his family had descended on us without warning or invitation. The stairs seemed steeper going down than they had coming up, each step requiring careful placement of my feet. I could hear the conversation more clearly now. James was asking about dinner plans, his tone easy and relaxed. Victoria was telling him about her day, something about shopping and lunch at a restaurant I didn't recognize. Margaret was setting the table in the dining room. I could hear the clink of dishes, the sound of drawers opening and closing as she located silverware. I reached the bottom of the stairs and paused in the hallway, taking a moment to steady myself before entering the living room. When I did, all eyes turned toward me. James immediately stood, crossing the room to take my arm and guide me to a chair. He asked how I was feeling, his concern genuine, his hand warm on my elbow. I told him I was okay though tired, and asked quietly what was going on. His expression shifted, something uncertain flickering across his features. Before he could answer, Victoria spoke up from her position on the settee. She explained, her voice bright and helpful, that they had decided it would be better for everyone if they stayed here for a while. Just until I was back on my feet, she assured me. It didn't make sense for me to be alone all day while James was at work, and besides, the kids were on fall break from school. It was perfect timing. The words hit me like a physical blow. Stay here, in my home, for an undefined period of time. I looked at James, searching his face for some sign that he understood how inappropriate this was, how presumptuous. But he was looking at Victoria with an expression of gratitude, thanking her for being so thoughtful, so willing to help during a difficult time. He turned to me with a smile, saying, "Wasn't it wonderful that we had family who cared so much?" I couldn't find words. My throat had closed up, shock and disbelief warring with the ingrained politeness that made it difficult to object to something framed as kindness. Victoria was already moving forward with the plan, telling Sophie to bring down her suitcase from the car, instructing Ethan to help his father carry in the bags. Bags, plural. They had come prepared to move in. Margaret emerged from the dining room, announcing that dinner was ready. She had made a casserole from ingredients she found in my refrigerator, she said proudly, and there was plenty for everyone. The group began moving toward the dining room, a choreographed dance that left me standing alone in the living room, still trying to process what had just happened. James returned to my side, taking my hand and asking gently if I needed help walking to the table. I let him guide me, my mind racing even as my body moved on autopilot. The dining room table, which James and I usually used only for special occasions, was set for 7. Margaret had used my good dishes, the vintage china I had collected piece by piece from antique stores. Victoria was already seated at the head of the table, the position I usually occupied when we hosted dinners. Derek took the seat beside her, and the children filled in the remaining chairs, leaving James and me to sit together at the opposite end. The casserole was passed around, everyone serving themselves with easy familiarity. Conversation flowed around me, questions about James's work, updates about Ethan's football season, Sophie's recent dance recital. I picked at my food, my appetite gone, my mind fixed on the surreal nature of what was unfolding. Nobody seemed to notice my silence. Or if they did, they attributed it to my recovery, to the natural fatigue of someone still healing from surgery. Victoria dominated the conversation, as she always did, her voice rising and falling with animated energy. She talked about her plans for redecorating her home in Dallas, about the vacation she and Derek were planning for next summer, about the new car she was considering. The words washed over me. Meaningless noise that failed to penetrate the growing sense of unreality that had settled over the evening. After dinner, Margaret insisted on cleaning up, shooing everyone out of the dining room and into the living room. James turned on the television, scrolling through options until he found a movie everyone could agree on. Victoria made herself comfortable again on the settee, this time with Derek beside her. The children spread out on the floor with pillows, and James guided me to the reading chair, settling me in with a blanket despite the warmth of the evening. I sat there in my own home, surrounded by people who were supposed to be family, and felt utterly alone. The first full day of their occupation began before dawn. I woke to the sound of footsteps on the stairs, heavy and deliberate, followed by the clatter of pots and pans in the kitchen below. My body protested as I shifted in bed, the surgical wounds pulling with a sharp reminder that I was still far from healed. The clock on my nightstand read 5:30 in the morning, an hour when the house was usually wrapped in silence, when I would normally still be deep in sleep, allowing my body the rest it desperately needed. I lay there listening to the sounds of my home being transformed into something unfamiliar. Cabinet doors opened and closed with careless force. The refrigerator door squeaked on its hinges, a sound I had been meaning to fix but hadn't gotten around to before the surgery. Water ran in the sink and I could hear the distinctive beep of my coffee maker being programmed, though I always set it the night before to brew at 7, timed perfectly for when James and I would wake. Beside me, James slept on, his breathing deep and even. He had always been a sound sleeper, able to block out noise and disturbance with an enviable ease. I envied him that ability now, as I stared at the ceiling and felt my sanctuary being dismantled piece by piece. The house that had always felt like an extension of myself, responsive to my rhythms and routines, was being reprogrammed to accommodate others. By the time I managed to get myself out of bed and dressed, moving with the careful slowness that my recovery demanded, the kitchen had been completely taken over. Margaret stood at the stove, flipping pancakes with practiced efficiency. Victoria sat at the small breakfast table I had refinished last spring, scrolling through her phone while sipping from my favorite mug, the handmade ceramic piece I had purchased from a local artist at the farmer's market. Sophie and Ethan were already dressed and seated at the counter, eating cereal from bowls that belonged to the set I reserved for special occasions. Margaret greeted me with a bright smile, asking how I had slept and whether I wanted pancakes. Before I could answer, Victoria looked up from her phone and made a comment about how late I was sleeping, how the day was already half over. I glanced at the clock above the sink. It was barely 6:15. The casual cruelty of the remark, disguised as teasing concern, hit me harder than it should have. I mumbled something about needing rest for recovery and moved toward the coffee maker, only to find that the carafe was already empty. Victoria noticed my hesitation and explained cheerfully that they had all had coffee already, that she had made a full pot but everyone was apparently quite thirsty this morning. She suggested I could make another pot if I wanted some, her tone implying that this was perfectly reasonable, that I should be grateful for the opportunity to serve myself in my own kitchen. I stood there holding the empty carafe, my hands trembling slightly from weakness and the surge of frustration I was trying to suppress. James appeared in the doorway, already dressed for work in one of his sharp suits. He looked energized, grateful even, as he thanked Margaret for making breakfast and commented on how nice it was to have a full house in the morning. He grabbed a travel mug from the cabinet, filled it with water since there was no coffee, and kissed my forehead before heading out the door. He would grab coffee on the way to the office, he said. He reminded me to rest and not overdo it, then he was gone, leaving me standing in the kitchen surrounded by his family. The day stretched ahead with an oppressive weight. Margaret announced that she would be doing laundry, asking where I kept the detergent and fabric softener. I directed her to the utility closet, watching as she gathered up towels and clothes with brisk efficiency. Victoria declared that she needed to make some business calls, and asked if my home office would be available. The question was rhetorical. She was already moving toward the sunroom before I could formulate a response. I retreated to the living room, settling carefully onto the sofa that Ethan had vacated. My laptop sat on the side table where I had left it days ago, and I opened it with the intention of checking in on my clients, responding to the emails that had surely piled up during my recovery. But I couldn't concentrate. The sounds of the house in chaos pulled at my attention. Margaret's voice drifted from upstairs as she talked to someone on her phone while sorting laundry. Victoria's business call carried from the office, her voice sharp and authoritative as she negotiated something with someone who clearly frustrated her. Sophie wandered into the living room and asked if she could watch something on the television. I started to explain that I was trying to work, but she had already picked up the remote and was scrolling through streaming options. Within moments, a loud animated show filled the room with music and dialogue. I closed my laptop, accepting that work was impossible under these conditions. My clients would have to wait another day. The morning dissolved into a blur of small invasions. Margaret reorganized my pantry, claiming she was just trying to be helpful, moving items I had arranged by frequency of use into alphabetical order that made no practical sense. Victoria emerged from my office to complain that my internet connection was too slow, suggesting I needed to upgrade my service provider. Ethan asked if he could use my computer for his homework, since his tablet battery had died and he couldn't find the charger. Each request, each rearrangement, each casual appropriation of my space and resources chipped away at my sense of control. By lunchtime, I was exhausted despite having done nothing but exist in my own home. Margaret made sandwiches, using the artisan bread I had bought for myself before the surgery, the expensive kind from the bakery across town that I considered a small luxury. She served them on paper plates, explaining that she didn't want to create more dishes to wash. I watched my carefully curated food supplies being consumed by people who hadn't asked permission, who seemed to view everything in the house as communal property available for their use. Victoria joined us in the kitchen for lunch, finally emerging from her hours-long occupancy of my office. She made a comment about how nice it must be for me to not have to work, to just relax at home all day. The implication stung. I wanted to explain that I was recovering from surgery, that I would be working if I could concentrate, if my home hadn't been transformed into a circus of activity. But the words stuck in my throat, blocked by years of conditioning that told me to be polite, to be grateful, to not make waves. The afternoon brought Derek home early from whatever business had occupied him that morning. He was a large man, comfortable taking up space, and he settled into my reading chair with a satisfied sigh. He asked Victoria about her day, listening with half attention as he scrolled through his phone. Margaret served him a sandwich and a beer from my refrigerator, treating him like a guest in a hotel rather than an uninvited occupant in someone else's home. I excused myself and climbed the stairs once more, seeking refuge in my bedroom. The effort left me breathless, a reminder that my body was still healing, still vulnerable. I lay down on top of the covers, not bothering to change out of my clothes, and closed my eyes against the tears that threatened to fall. This was my home. I had worked for years to afford it, had poured countless hours into restoring it, had created a space that reflected my values and my aesthetic. And now it felt like a hotel where I was the least important guest. Sleep claimed me eventually, a fitful rest filled with anxious dreams. I woke to darkness outside my window and voices downstairs that suggested dinner was underway. The clock showed 7:30. I had slept for hours, my body demanding rest even as my mind raced with worry. I could smell cooking, something rich and savory that made my stomach clench with hunger despite my emotional turmoil. Downstairs, I found the dining room table set again with my good china. James had returned from work and was opening a bottle of wine. His tie loosened and his jacket hung over the back of a chair. Derek stood beside him, the two men discussing something about investments and market trends. Victoria was setting out serving dishes filled with pasta and salad, while Margaret pulled garlic bread from the oven. The scene looked almost normal, like a family gathering planned and anticipated, rather than an invasion that had happened without my consent. James saw me in the doorway and smiled, gesturing me to the table. He asked if I felt better after my nap, his concern genuine even if his understanding of the situation was completely absent. I took my seat, the same position from last night, at the far end of the table from where Victoria had once again installed herself at the head. The meal proceeded with the same pattern as the previous evening, conversation flowing around me while I picked at my food and tried to make sense of how my life had been so thoroughly disrupted. After dinner, Victoria made an announcement. She had been thinking, she said, about how difficult it must be for me to manage the house in my current condition. She had decided that she would take over the household management for the duration of their stay. She would handle the grocery shopping, the meal planning, the general organization of daily life. That way, I could focus entirely on my recovery without any stress or responsibility. The offer was presented as generosity, as sisterly concern. James responded with immediate gratitude, thanking Victoria for being so thoughtful, so willing to sacrifice her time to help us. Margaret nodded approvingly, adding that this was exactly what family did for each other in times of need. Derek raised his wine glass in a small toast to Victoria's kindness. Even the children seemed to understand that their mother was being praised, Sophie smiling proudly while Ethan returned his attention to his phone. I sat frozen, unable to voice the objection that screamed in my mind. This wasn't help. This was a complete takeover. Victoria was claiming authority over my home, my space, my carefully maintained systems of organization and routine. But how could I object without seeming ungrateful? How could I refuse what was being framed as care and support? The trap was perfect, constructed with the language of family obligation and concern, leaving me no room to protest without appearing selfish or unreasonable. That night, lying in bed beside James, I tried to articulate my discomfort. I chose my words carefully, explaining that while I appreciated his family's concern, their presence was actually making it harder for me to rest. The house was too noisy, too chaotic. I couldn't maintain my recovery routine with so many people demanding attention and creating disruption. James listened, his hand finding mine in the darkness, and I felt a flicker of hope that he understood. But his response extinguished that hope immediately. He said that I was probably just feeling overwhelmed because I was used to being independent, used to managing everything myself. He suggested that I should try to relax and let others take care of things for a change. His family loved me, he insisted. They just wanted to help. It would only be for a little while until I was stronger and more capable. Then everything would go back to normal. His words, meant to comfort, instead filled me with a creeping dread. How long was a little while? What did normal even mean anymore? I wanted to push harder to make him see that this wasn't right, that his family's help felt more like colonization than support. But exhaustion overwhelmed me, the kind of bone-deep weariness that comes from fighting battles your body isn't strong enough to sustain. I let the conversation drop, turning onto my side and closing my eyes, feeling James's arm drape over me in what he thought was protective comfort. The second day followed the pattern of the first, with small escalations that individually seemed insignificant, but collectively built into something oppressive. Margaret took it upon herself to reorganize my kitchen cabinets, claiming she couldn't find anything in my system. Victoria announced at breakfast that she had invited her friend Patricia to visit that afternoon, someone I had never met but who apparently needed advice that only Victoria could provide. Derek commandeered the television remote and spent the entire morning watching sports, the volume loud enough to be heard throughout the house. I tried to work from the small desk in my bedroom, setting up my laptop and pulling up client files. But the internet connection was indeed slower than usual, likely strained by multiple devices streaming and downloading simultaneously. A video call with a client became an exercise in frustration as the connection dropped repeatedly, my professional credibility damaged by technical difficulties that had never been an issue before. By the afternoon, when Patricia arrived with her own teenage daughter in tow, the house felt completely foreign to me. I watched from the top of the stairs as Victoria gave her friend a tour, pointing out features of the house as if she owned it, explaining the vintage details and restoration work that I had completed. Patricia made admiring comments, asking Victoria where she had found such lovely pieces, and Victoria accepted the compliments without correction, without acknowledging that none of it was hers. The daughter, a girl about Sophie's age, asked if they had a pool. Victoria laughed and said unfortunately no, but there was a beautiful park nearby where the girls could go if they wanted. She turned to Margaret and asked if she would mind taking the girls to the park, framing it as a favor even though Margaret immediately agreed, always eager to be useful. Within minutes, Margaret had gathered up Sophie and the visiting girl and headed out, leaving Victoria and Patricia alone in my living room to have what sounded like a very personal conversation. I remained upstairs, feeling like an intruder in my own home, unable to go down and reclaim my space without interrupting what Victoria had clearly established as her domain. The irony was bitter. I was trapped in my bedroom, essentially confined to one room of a house I owned, because asserting my presence felt like it would cause more stress and conflict than simply staying hidden. James came home that evening to find the house in full social mode. Patricia was still there, now with her husband who had joined after work. Derek had arranged for pizza delivery, ordering enough for everyone without consulting me about preferences or dietary restrictions. The living room and dining room were full of people I barely knew, all of them treating my home like a casual gathering space, their voices loud and their laughter filling every corner. I made an appearance, forcing myself down the stairs despite my exhaustion, because staying hidden felt like surrender. But the moment I entered the room, I felt the shift in energy. Conversations paused. Eyes turned toward me. Victoria stood and made introductions, presenting me to her friends as if I were a distant relative visiting rather than the owner of the home they were occupying. She explained, with a tone of sympathetic concern, that I was recovering from surgery and probably needed to rest soon. The implication was clear. I was the sick person, the invalid who needed protection and quiet. My presence was disrupting the social gathering that Victoria had orchestrated. Patricia smiled at me with pity, making some comment about how difficult recovery must be. Her husband nodded sympathetically. Even James, my own husband, looked at me with an expression that suggested he agreed with Victoria's assessment that I should probably go back upstairs and rest. I stood there feeling the weight of their collective judgment, their shared understanding that I was the problem, the inconvenient element that didn't quite fit into the smooth operation of the evening. Part of me wanted to scream, to demand that they all leave, to assert my ownership and my right to exist in my own space without apology. But I was so tired. My body ached. The surgical wounds throbbed with a persistence that no amount of pain medication could fully suppress. And I was outnumbered, surrounded by people who saw me as an obstacle rather than a person deserving of consideration. So I did what they expected. I excused myself, climbed the stairs once more, and retreated to my bedroom. Behind me, I heard the conversation resume, the laughter return, the party continue without pause. I closed the bedroom door and sank onto the edge of the bed, my hands shaking as the full weight of my situation finally crystallized into clear understanding. This wasn't temporary. This wasn't help. This was a methodical displacement, a systematic takeover of my home and my life. Victoria had positioned herself as the competent one, the capable family member who could manage a household while the poor sick Elena recovered upstairs. She had transformed my identity from homeowner and independent professional to invalid and burden, someone who needed to be cared for and managed, rather than respected and consulted. And James, my husband, the person who should have been my advocate and protector, saw nothing wrong with any of it. He was grateful for his family's help, blind to the way that help had morphed into occupation. He came upstairs an hour later, after the guests had finally left, and found me sitting in the dark. He asked gently if I was feeling okay, if the pain was worse. He suggested I take my medication and try to sleep. He kissed my forehead and told me everything would be better in the morning. But I knew it wouldn't be. Morning would bring another day of being a stranger in my own home, of watching my space be claimed and my routines be disrupted. Morning would bring more of Victoria's helpful management and Margaret's well-meaning reorganization. Morning would bring another 24 hours of feeling invisible and powerless, while everyone around me celebrated how wonderful it was that family could come together in times of need. I took my medication as James suggested, not because I believed it would make things better, but because the physical pain was at least something I could address. The emotional pain, the sense of violation and helplessness, had no simple remedy. I lay in the darkness listening to James's breathing slow into sleep, and I began to understand that if anything was going to change, I would have to be the one to change it. Nobody else saw a problem. Nobody else felt the walls closing in. If I wanted my life back, I would have to fight for it. Even though I could barely stand without feeling dizzy. The thought should have been empowering. Instead, it just made me feel more alone. The third morning arrived with a soundtrack I had come to dread. The house woke before I did, filled with the sounds of people moving through spaces that should have been quiet. I lay in bed listening to the rhythm of occupation, the opening and closing of doors, the rush of water through pipes, the low murmur of conversation punctuated by occasional laughter. My body felt heavy, weighed down not just by the lingering effects of surgery, but by something deeper, a fatigue that had settled into my bones. I thought about the years I had spent working toward this life. The early days of my consulting career when I had taken on any client who would hire me, working late into the night to build a reputation for reliability and expertise. The careful saving, the budget spreadsheets where I tracked every dollar, the deliberate choice to forego vacations and luxuries so I could afford the down payment on this house. I remembered the first time I had walked through the front door as the owner, the keys heavy in my hand, the sense of accomplishment that had filled my chest until I thought I might burst with pride. That house had represented freedom. It was proof that I didn't need to rely on anyone else for security or stability. My own career, my own choices, my own sanctuary. I had chosen every paint color, selected every piece of furniture, planted every flower in the garden. The restoration work had been painstaking, requiring research into period-appropriate materials and techniques. I had learned to refinish wood, to repair plaster, to restore vintage fixtures. Each project had been an act of love, a way of honoring the history of the structure while making it unmistakably mine. And I had done it all while building a business that allowed me to work from home, to maintain the kind of independence that so many people claim to want but few actually achieved. My clients trusted me with their financial futures. I analyzed market trends, made investment recommendations, managed portfolios worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. The work required focus, expertise, and a level of responsibility that demanded respect. I was good at what I did. I had earned everything I had through competence and dedication. But lying in that bed, listening to strangers move through my home with casual ownership, I felt all of that accomplishment crumbling. Victoria's voice drifted up from downstairs, giving instructions to someone about something. Margaret responded with her usual eagerness to please. The children's voices joined in, Ethan asking about breakfast and Sophie wondering aloud if they could go to the pool at the community center later. Normal family conversation, the kind that would have been unremarkable anywhere else. But here in my home it felt like erasure. I forced myself out of bed, moving through the painful process of getting dressed. The surgical wounds had started to heal, the angry red of the incisions fading to pink, but the internal healing was taking longer. My body felt fragile, prone to sudden waves of dizziness if I moved too quickly or stood for too long. The doctors had said it would take weeks before I felt normal again, possibly months before I regained my full strength. In the meantime, I was trapped in this diminished version of myself, unable to physically defend my territory or assert my presence with any real force. Downstairs, I found the kitchen in a state of controlled chaos. Margaret was making pancakes again, the griddle sizzling as she poured batter in perfect circles. Victoria sat at the breakfast table with her laptop open, video chatting with someone I didn't recognize. Sophie and Ethan were eating cereal at the counter, their bowls creating wet rings on the surface I had carefully sealed last year to protect the vintage wood. Derek was nowhere to be seen, presumably still asleep or already out handling whatever business occupied his days. I moved toward the coffee maker, hoping that today there might actually be some left. The carafe held about half a cup, lukewarm and bitter from sitting too long on the heating plate. I poured it into a mug anyway, adding milk to make it palatable, and leaned against the counter while I sipped it slowly. Margaret glanced over at me and asked brightly if I wanted pancakes. Before I could answer, Victoria ended her video call and looked up from her laptop. She studied me for a moment, her expression shifting into something that might have been concern but felt more like assessment. She commented that I looked tired, that perhaps I wasn't getting enough rest. She suggested that maybe I should consider setting up a bed downstairs, in the small guest room off the kitchen, so I wouldn't have to climb the stairs so often. The room was barely large enough for a twin bed and a small dresser, more of a storage space than an actual bedroom. The suggestion of moving me there, isolating me further from my own bedroom and the master suite I shared with James, was presented as practical advice for my health. I opened my mouth to refuse, to explain that I was fine in my own bedroom, but Margaret chimed in with enthusiastic agreement. She said it was a wonderful idea, that she could help set up the room this very afternoon. Sophie looked up from her cereal and asked if that meant she could have the big bedroom upstairs, the one with the window seat that looked out over the garden. Victoria laughed and said maybe, depending on how long they were staying and what Elena needed for her recovery. The casual discussion of redistributing the bedrooms in my house, of moving me into the smallest and least comfortable space while others claimed the rooms I had carefully designed and furnished, finally broke through my stunned paralysis. I said no. The word came out more forcefully than I intended, sharp enough to cut through the morning conversation and draw everyone's attention. I repeated it, trying to soften my tone while maintaining firmness. I was fine in my own bedroom. I didn't need to be moved to the guest room. I appreciated the concern, but I would continue sleeping upstairs. The silence that followed was thick with unspoken judgment. Margaret looked confused, as if she couldn't understand why anyone would refuse such helpful advice. Sophie returned to her cereal with a small shrug, already dismissing the adult conversation as boring. Ethan never looked up from his phone, but Victoria's expression hardened, her eyes narrowing slightly as she regarded me with something that looked like disappointment. She said calmly that she was only trying to help, that she could see I was struggling and thought it would be easier for me to have everything on one level. She added that it wasn't healthy for me to be so prideful about my independence when I was clearly still in recovery. The words were delivered with a tone of reasonable concern, but the underlying message was clear. I was being difficult. I was refusing sensible assistance out of stubbornness. I was making my own recovery harder by not accepting the wisdom of those who knew better. Margaret tried to smooth over the tension, suggesting that we could all discuss it later when I had more energy to think clearly. The implication that my current mental state was compromised, that I wasn't capable of making reasonable decisions, stung more than the original suggestion. I set down my coffee mug, no longer able to stomach the bitter liquid, and excused myself from the kitchen. Behind me, I heard Victoria sigh, and Margaret murmur something sympathetic about how difficult recovery could be on a person's mood. I made my way to the sunroom that served as my office, the one space in the house where I had hoped to find some measure of privacy and control. But even that had been compromised. The desk where I usually worked had been moved to accommodate Victoria's larger setup. Her laptop occupied the center space, flanked by notebooks and file folders that didn't belong to me. My own files had been stacked haphazardly on the bookshelf, my carefully organized system disrupted by her need for space. I stood in the doorway, looking at the transformation of my workspace into hers, and felt something inside me begin to shift. The fatigue and confusion that had dominated my response to the invasion started to give way to something sharper, clearer. This wasn't just inconvenient. This wasn't just uncomfortable. This was wrong. What Victoria was doing, what the entire family was doing with their casual appropriation of my home, and their dismissal of my objections, was fundamentally wrong. But recognizing that something was wrong didn't immediately translate into knowing how to fix it. I was still weak, still dependent on James for transportation and assistance with basic tasks. I was still bound by the social expectations that made it difficult to confront family members without appearing ungrateful or unreasonable. And I was still operating without any clear evidence that what they were doing was anything more than misguided helpfulness, the kind of overreach that happens in families when boundaries aren't clearly communicated. I decided to start documenting everything. If I couldn't stop what was happening in the moment, I could at least create a record of it. I retrieved my laptop from where it had been relocated to the bookshelf and carried it back upstairs to my bedroom. Sitting on the edge of the bed, I opened a new document and began writing down everything I could remember from the past few days. The unexpected arrival, the immediate occupation of space, the reorganization of my kitchen and office, the dismissal of my objections, the suggestions that I move to a smaller room. As I typed, patterns began to emerge. Every interaction, every suggestion, every helpful gesture had the effect of diminishing my authority and increasing Victoria's control. She had positioned herself as the competent manager while framing me as the incapable patient. Margaret reinforced this dynamic by treating Victoria's decisions as final and treating me as someone whose preferences were symptoms of illness, rather than valid expressions of autonomy. Even James, when he was present, deferred to his sister's judgment about household matters, trusting her assessment of what I needed more than my own statements about what I wanted. The documentation process was both clarifying and infuriating. Seeing the pattern laid out in black and white made it impossible to dismiss my concerns as oversensitivity or misunderstanding. This was systematic. This was deliberate. Victoria might not have consciously planned every step, but she was certainly taking advantage of my vulnerability to establish herself as the primary authority in my home. And every day that passed, every routine that was altered to suit her preferences, made it harder to imagine reclaiming what had been taken. I spent most of that day in my bedroom, alternating between documenting events and trying to rest. The solitude was both a relief and a source of anxiety. I was grateful to be away from the chaos downstairs, but I also knew that every hour I spent hidden in my room was an hour in which Victoria consolidated her position. She was probably making decisions right now about dinner, about household supplies that needed to be purchased, about plans for tomorrow and the day after. Each decision she made without consulting me was another brick in the wall she was building between me and my own life. In the late afternoon, James came home early. I heard his voice downstairs, greeting his family with warmth and humor. Victoria's laughter rang out, followed by Derek's deep chuckle. They were discussing something about a restaurant, debating the merits of different cuisines. Then James's footsteps on the stairs, and he appeared in the doorway of our bedroom with a smile that faded when he saw me sitting on the bed with my laptop. He asked what I was doing, his tone suggesting that he had expected to find me napping or at least resting more passively. I told him I was working, trying to catch up on client emails and project updates. The lie came easily, protective. I wasn't ready to tell him about the documentation I was creating, about the growing certainty that his family's presence was not the helpful gesture he believed it to be. He accepted the explanation with a nod, then shared the news that had brought him home early. They were all going out to dinner tonight, to a new restaurant downtown that Victoria had been wanting to try. He had made a reservation for 7 people. I felt my stomach drop as I processed the number. 7. Victoria, Derek, Margaret, Sophie, Ethan, James, and presumably me. But James continued talking, explaining that he thought it would be good for me to get out of the house, to have a change of scenery. Victoria had suggested it, recognizing that I had been cooped up too long and probably feeling isolated. The thoughtfulness of the gesture, as James presented it, was undercut by the fact that nobody had asked me if I wanted to go out to dinner. Nobody had checked if I felt strong enough for the effort of getting dressed, driving downtown, sitting in a loud restaurant for hours. The decision had been made, the reservation confirmed, and I was simply expected to comply. James was already moving toward the closet, suggesting outfits I might wear, treating the evening as a settled matter rather than a question to be discussed. I wanted to refuse. I wanted to say that I wasn't feeling up to it, that I would rather stay home and rest. But the thought of being alone in the house while they all went out without me was somehow worse than the prospect of enduring a difficult dinner. If I stayed home, they would have hours to bond, as a family unit, to share a pleasant experience that would further normalize their occupation of my space. And they would return home full of stories and inside jokes. Their connection deepened while I remained on the outside looking in. So I agreed to go. I let James help me select an outfit that was comfortable enough for my still healing body but presentable enough for a nice restaurant. I applied minimal makeup, trying to cover the exhaustion that had settled into the hollows beneath my eyes. When I came downstairs, Victoria looked me over with an expression that might have been approval, or might have been surprised that I had actually made the effort. Margaret complimented my dress, and the children were too absorbed in their phones to notice my appearance at all. The drive downtown was accomplished in 2 vehicles, James and me in our car, the rest of the family in Derek's larger SUV. The separation gave me a brief respite, a few minutes alone with my husband where I thought I might be able to talk to him about what was really happening. But James was in high spirits, talking about how nice it was to have family around, how grateful he was for Victoria's willingness to help during my recovery. He mentioned that his sister had always been the responsible one in the family, the person everyone could count on in a crisis. His words painted a picture of Victoria that didn't match my experience, but I couldn't find a way to articulate the difference without sounding petty or jealous. How could I explain that her responsibility felt like control, that her helpfulness felt like invasion? James saw his sister through the lens of decades of family history, memories of her as the older sibling who had looked out for him, who had set an example of competence and capability. My few days of discomfort couldn't compete with that deep foundation of trust and affection. The restaurant was loud and crowded, filled with young professionals celebrating the end of the work week. We were seated at a large round table near the back, and somehow the arrangement placed me between Margaret and Ethan, with James on Ethan's other side and Victoria directly across from me. The positioning felt deliberate, isolating me between the child who barely acknowledged my presence and the mother-in-law whose constant helpfulness had become oppressive. Dinner unfolded with agonizing slowness. Victoria dominated the conversation, telling stories about her life in Dallas, about the challenges of managing a household and raising children, while Derek traveled frequently for business. She spoke with the confidence of someone accustomed to holding an audience, her voice carrying across the table and drawing attention from neighboring diners. Margaret asked questions that prompted more stories, and James laughed at memories from their childhood that Victoria recounted with theatrical flair. I picked at my food, my appetite suppressed by pain medication and anxiety. The surgical wounds ached with the prolonged sitting, and the noise of the restaurant pressed against my skull like a physical weight. I tried to engage in the conversation, to respond when questions were directed at me, but my contributions felt thin and inadequate compared to Victoria's animated storytelling. At one point, Sophie asked me a question about my work, and I started to explain the basics of financial consulting, but Victoria interrupted to tell a tangentially related story about an investment mistake a friend had made. And the conversation moved on without me. By the time dessert arrived, I was counting the minutes until I could reasonably suggest that we leave. My body had reached its limit, the combination of physical discomfort and emotional exhaustion creating a desperate need for solitude and silence. But Victoria was in no hurry, ordering another glass of wine and encouraging everyone to try different desserts and share. James seemed to be enjoying himself thoroughly, relaxed in a way I hadn't seen in weeks, and I realized that he was relieved to have the burden of my care distributed among multiple people. That realization hurt more than anything else that had happened. My husband, the person who had vowed to support me in sickness and health, was grateful that his family had taken over that support. He didn't see it as a problem that I had been effectively sidelined in my own life. He saw it as a solution, a way for him to focus on his demanding career while knowing I was being taken care of. The fact that I didn't feel cared for, that I felt suffocated and displaced, wasn't registering as important enough to override his relief. We finally left the restaurant after 9 o'clock, more than 3 hours after we had arrived. The drive home was quieter, James's energy flagging as the evening caught up with him. He asked if I had enjoyed dinner, and I made some non-committal positive response, too tired to start the conversation that needed to be had. Back at the house, everyone scattered to their claimed spaces. Victoria and Derek disappeared into the guest room that had become theirs. Margaret settled into the smaller bedroom upstairs that she had appropriated. The children went to their temporary spaces with the easy adaptability of youth. James and I climbed the stairs to our bedroom, and he was asleep within minutes of his head hitting the pillow. I lay beside him in the darkness, my mind racing despite my body's exhaustion. The documentation I had started earlier weighed on me. I knew I needed to add tonight's dinner to the record, to note how decisions were being made without my input, how my presence was becoming increasingly peripheral to activities in my own life. But I also knew that documentation alone wouldn't solve anything. I needed a plan. I needed to understand not just what was happening but why. What was Victoria gaining from this situation? What did she want that required taking over my home and my life? The answers weren't immediately obvious, but I sensed that there was something beneath the surface, some motivation that went beyond simple family concern or misguided helpfulness. People didn't systematically dismantle someone else's autonomy without a reason, even if that reason was unconscious or rationalized as kindness. As I lay there in the darkness, listening to James's steady breathing and the sounds of the house settling around me, I made a decision. Tomorrow I would start looking for answers. I would go through my office more carefully, searching for clues about what Victoria was doing during her hours alone in there. I would pay attention to her phone calls and her computer activity. I would document not just the obvious invasions, but the subtle patterns of behavior that might reveal her true intentions. It felt almost paranoid, this decision to investigate my sister-in-law as if she were a criminal rather than family. But my instincts were screaming that something was wrong, that this situation was more dangerous than it appeared. And I had learned over the years of building my business to trust those instincts, to investigate thoroughly before making judgments but not to dismiss concerns simply because they made me uncomfortable. Tomorrow, I would begin the work of understanding exactly what I was dealing with. Tonight, I would rest and gather my strength for whatever I might discover. The house around me felt like foreign territory now, occupied by people who had no right to be there but who had claimed it nonetheless. But it was still my house legally and morally, and I was still capable of fighting for it, even if that fight had to be conducted from a position of weakness and vulnerability. I closed my eyes and focused on breathing slowly and deeply, willing my body to relax enough for sleep. The path ahead was unclear, but at least I had taken the first step toward action rather than passive acceptance. That small victory would have to be enough for now. Morning came with a harsh clarity that cut through the fog of pain medication and exhaustion. I woke before anyone else, the house still wrapped in pre-dawn silence, and immediately felt the difference in my body. The surgical wound still ached, but beneath that familiar discomfort was something new. A sharpness of purpose that made me feel more alert than I had in days. I moved carefully out of bed, trying not to wake James, and made my way downstairs in the dim light that filtered through the windows. The house looked different in this early hour, stripped of the animated presence that usually filled it. I could see it clearly now, the subtle rearrangements that had accumulated over the past days. The photographs on the mantel had been shifted to make room for Victoria's collection of coffee mugs and charging cables. The throw pillows I had selected to complement the vintage sofa had been replaced by ones that matched nothing, brought from Victoria's own collection. Even the air smelled different, layered with unfamiliar perfumes, and the lingering scent of last night's dinner. I moved through the room slowly, cataloging changes with a more critical eye than I had managed before. In the kitchen, the pantry organization that Margaret had implemented made no practical sense, grouping items by arbitrary categories that required opening multiple cabinets to prepare a single meal. The refrigerator was packed with foods I would never have purchased, expensive organic items and specialty ingredients that someone had bought without consulting me about the cost or the need. A quick calculation suggested that several $100s had been spent on groceries in just a few days, charged to accounts I would ultimately be responsible for paying. But it was my office that held the most revealing evidence of what was really happening. I pushed open the door to the sunroom and surveyed the transformation more carefully than I had before. Victoria's laptop sat closed on the desk, connected to my printer and surrounded by documents that I hadn't noticed in my earlier, more emotional assessment of the space. I moved closer, careful not to disturb anything, and began reading what was visible without actually touching her things. The papers were financial documents, but not the kind related to her personal accounts or business dealings. These were applications and forms related to property assessment and tax appeals. I saw my address listed on several pages, references to recent improvements and restoration work that I had completed over the years. My hands began to tremble as I picked up one of the documents and read it more carefully. It was an application for homestead exemption, filed in Victoria's name, listing her as the primary resident of my address. The implications crashed over me like a wave. This wasn't just about temporarily staying in my home during my recovery. Victoria was attempting to establish legal residency at my address, creating a paper trail that would support a claim that this was her primary residence, rather than mine. I set down the document with shaking hands and looked through the others more carefully. There were utility bills that had been redirected to show her name, change of address forms filed with various institutions, even a voter registration update listing my address as her permanent residence. The documentation was methodical and comprehensive, suggesting a level of planning that had begun well before my surgery. I thought back to the weeks leading up to my procedure, trying to remember if there had been signs I had missed. Victoria had called several times, asking detailed questions about my health and the expected recovery timeline. She had offered to help coordinate my post-surgery care, suggesting that family should be involved in supporting me through a difficult time. I had appreciated her concern, never imagining that she was gathering information to execute a plan that would displace me from my own home. I sat down heavily in the desk chair, my mind racing to make sense of what I was seeing. Why would Victoria want to claim residency at my address? What possible benefit could that provide her? The answers began to crystallize as I thought about conversations from family gatherings over the years. Victoria and Derek had been struggling financially, though they hid it well behind their affluent facade. Derek's business had suffered setbacks, investments had gone sour, and they were over-leveraged on the Dallas property. I remember James mentioning months ago that his sister was stressed about money, though he had assured me it was nothing serious. But what if it was serious? What if they were facing foreclosure or bankruptcy? Establishing residency in Texas, particularly at an address in Austin with its more favorable tax structure and homestead protections, could provide legal and financial advantages. If Victoria could claim my home as her primary residence, she might be able to shield assets from creditors or reposition their financial situation in a way that protected them from consequences they were facing in Dallas. The realization made me feel sick. She wasn't here to help me recover. She was here to colonize my home for her own financial survival. I heard movement upstairs, the sound of someone stirring in one of the bedrooms. I quickly straightened the documents to appear undisturbed and left the office, closing the door quietly behind me. My heart was pounding, adrenaline surging through my system despite my body's weakened state. I needed to think carefully about what to do with this information. Confronting Victoria directly would likely lead to denial and possibly to her destroying evidence. I needed to secure copies of everything I had found, and I needed professional legal advice about how to protect myself and my property. Back in the kitchen, I started a pot of coffee with trembling hands. The familiar ritual helped steady my nerves even as my mind continued to race. I pulled out my phone and began taking photographs of everything in the office, using the early morning light to capture clear images of the documents Victoria had left scattered across my desk. Each photo was date-stamped and geotagged, creating a record that would be difficult to dispute. I backed up the photos to multiple cloud storage accounts, ensuring that even if my phone was taken or damaged, the evidence would remain accessible. Margaret was the first to come downstairs, appearing in the kitchen doorway with a cheerful greeting that felt jarringly at odds with what I had just discovered. She commented on how early I was up, suggesting that perhaps I was feeling better if I had the energy to be awake before everyone else. I forced a smile and agreed that I was feeling somewhat improved, though in truth I felt more shaken than I had since the day of my surgery. She began making breakfast with her usual efficiency, moving through my kitchen as if it belonged to her, and I watched her with new understanding. Margaret wasn't just Victoria's enabler. She was likely complicit in whatever plan her daughter had constructed. The reorganization of my home, the constant suggestions that I rest and not worry about household management, the pushing for me to move to a smaller bedroom, all of it served to establish Victoria as the functional resident while reducing me to the status of temporary guest or invalid relative. They had been systematically erasing my presence and replacing it with Victoria's, creating a reality that could be supported by the legal documents I had found in my office. Victoria appeared next, looking fresh and energized despite the late night. She greeted me warmly, asking how I had slept and whether I had enjoyed dinner at the restaurant. Her performance of sisterly concern was flawless, and I marveled at how easily she maintained the facade while actively working to steal my home from under me. I responded with matching pleasantness, having learned over years in business that showing your hand too early was a strategic mistake. If she thought I was still the confused, vulnerable patient she had been manipulating, she would continue leaving evidence of her plans where I could document it. James came down shortly after, running late for an important meeting at work. He grabbed coffee and a piece of toast, kissing me distractedly on the forehead before heading out the door. I watched him leave with a mixture of sadness and frustration. He still saw nothing wrong with the situation, still viewed his family's presence as entirely benign. The thought of explaining what I had discovered filled me with dread. Would he believe me? Would he think I was overreacting or misinterpreting innocent documents? The fact that I had to question whether my own husband would trust my judgment felt like another betrayal layered on top of the primary one. After breakfast, I excused myself and returned to the bedroom with my laptop, claiming I needed to catch up on work emails. Instead, I began researching Texas property law, homestead exemptions, and residency requirements. What I learned confirmed my worst suspicions. If Victoria could establish that she had been living at my address as her primary residence for a certain period, she could potentially claim homestead rights that would be difficult to challenge. The homestead exemption in Texas provided significant protections against creditors and could shield substantial equity in a property from being seized to satisfy debts. The genius of her plan was its exploitation of my vulnerability. I was recovering from surgery, visibly weak and dependent on others for basic assistance. If this ever came before a judge, Victoria could argue that she had moved in to provide essential care, that her residency was established out of family obligation rather than financial opportunism. The document she was filing during my recovery would create a timeline that supported her narrative, while I was too sick and confused to effectively challenge it. I needed help, professional help from someone who understood property law and could advise me on how to protect my interests without destroying my marriage in the process. I pulled up the website for a law firm in Austin that specialized in real estate and family law, scanning through attorney profiles until I found someone who seemed appropriate. Robert Fisher had been practicing for 15 years, with a focus on property disputes and residential real estate issues. His credentials were impressive, and the reviews from former clients suggested he was both competent and discreet. I called the office and explained in vague terms that I was dealing with a family member who had moved into my home and was now taking actions that concerned me regarding the property. The receptionist was professional and understanding, scheduling a consultation for the following afternoon. The appointment felt like a lifeline, a concrete step toward regaining control of a situation that had spiraled beyond anything I could manage alone. But it also meant I had to survive another full day of pretending everything was normal while Victoria continued to execute whatever plan she had set in motion. The rest of that morning passed with agonizing slowness. Victoria spent hours in my office on phone calls that I could hear through the closed door, her voice rising and falling in tones that suggested she was handling serious business. Margaret kept herself busy with housework, cleaning spaces that were already clean and reorganizing areas that didn't need reorganization. The children were occupied with their devices, barely aware of the adult drama unfolding around them. I moved through the house like a ghost, present but invisible, documenting everything while trying not to draw attention to my new vigilance. In the early afternoon, Derek returned from wherever he spent his mornings and announced that he and Victoria needed to run some errands. They would be gone for a few hours, he said, and Margaret would stay with me in case I needed anything. The transparent implication that I required supervision, that I couldn't be trusted alone in my own home, would have been insulting if it hadn't served my purposes perfectly. The moment their car pulled out of the driveway, I made my move. I went directly to my office, this time with the intention of thoroughly documenting everything. I photographed every document on the desk, every file folder, every notation in the margins of the forms Victoria had been completing. I found bank statements that showed accounts in her name using my address, credit card applications that listed my property as her residence, and even correspondence with creditors that referenced her new living situation in Austin. The paper trail was extensive and damning, proof of systematic fraud being committed while I was too weak to effectively resist. But the most chilling discovery was tucked into a folder labeled with my name. Inside were medical records that Victoria had somehow obtained, documentation of my surgery and recovery timeline. There were also notes in her handwriting, calculating how long I would likely be incapacitated, and when I might recover enough to notice what was happening around me. She had literally planned the takeover of my home around my surgical schedule, timing her move to coincide with my maximum vulnerability. The cold calculation of it took my breath away. I photographed everything, then carefully returned items to their original positions so Victoria wouldn't realize I had been through her files. Back in my bedroom, I uploaded all the new photos to secure cloud storage and began drafting a detailed timeline of events from the moment Victoria had arrived through this morning's discoveries. The document grew to several pages, a comprehensive record of invasion and deception that I hoped would be sufficient to protect my property and my rights. Margaret called up the stairs to ask if I wanted lunch, and I forced myself to go down and maintain the fiction that nothing had changed. I ate the sandwich she had prepared, made small talk about the weather and the children's activities, and accepted her fussing over whether I had taken my medication with a patience I didn't feel. Every interaction felt like a performance now, a careful dance where I had to hide what I knew while gathering more information. When Victoria and Derek returned in the late afternoon, they were carrying shopping bags and wearing expressions of satisfaction that suggested their errands had been successful. Victoria mentioned casually that she had stopped by the county assessor's office to update some records, and I had to concentrate on keeping my expression neutral. She was moving forward with her plan openly now, so confident that I was too incapacitated to interfere that she felt comfortable mentioning her activities. The audacity was breathtaking. That evening, James came home exhausted from his long day at work. Victoria had prepared dinner, an elaborate meal that filled the house with appetizing smells and required setting the dining room table with my good china once again. We sat down to eat like a functional family, passing dishes and making conversation while I sat in my designated spot, and wondered how much longer I could maintain this charade. James complimented his sister on the meal, thanked her again for being so helpful, and talked about his day with the relaxed air of someone who had no idea his home was being stolen from under him. After dinner, I told James the first needed to run an errand the following afternoon and asked if he could arrange to leave work early to drive me. I fabricated a story about a follow-up appointment with my surgeon, knowing he wouldn't question medical care. He agreed immediately, concern flickering across his features as he asked if everything was okay with my recovery. I assured him I was fine, just being cautious, and he accepted the explanation without probing deeper. That night, lying beside my sleeping husband, I reviewed everything I had learned and everything I had documented. The evidence was clear and compelling. Victoria was committing fraud, using my temporary incapacity to establish false residency and create legal claims to my property. She had planned it carefully, timing her actions to exploit my weakness and using her position as concerned family member to mask her true intentions. Margaret was complicit, helping to create the appearance of Victoria as the functional head of household while I was reduced to invalid status. But evidence alone wouldn't solve my problem. I needed a strategy for using that evidence effectively, for protecting my property without destroying my relationship with James in the process. My husband loved his sister, trusted her implicitly based on decades of family history. Convincing him that she was capable of such calculated betrayal would require more than just showing him documents. It would require carefully constructed proof that even he couldn't explain away or rationalize as misunderstanding. The consultation with Robert Fisher tomorrow would be crucial. I needed to understand my legal options, the steps I could take to secure my property and remove Victoria's false claims from official records. I also needed advice on how to handle the personal dimensions of the situation, how to protect myself legally while trying to preserve my marriage if that was even possible. Part of me wondered if James would ultimately choose his family over me, if the evidence I presented would drive a wedge between us that could never be repaired. But I couldn't let fear of that outcome prevent me from taking action. This was my home, earned through years of work and sacrifice. It represented my independence, my security, and my right to exist as an autonomous person, rather than someone to be managed and displaced at others' convenience. Victoria had gambled that I was too weak, too confused, and too conditioned to avoid conflict to effectively resist her plans. She had underestimated me, mistaking physical vulnerability for helplessness and recovery fatigue for stupidity. Tomorrow I would begin the process of fighting back. I would meet with the attorney, present my evidence, and develop a comprehensive strategy for reclaiming what was mine. I would do it carefully and methodically, with the same attention to detail and strategic thinking that had made me successful in my career. Victoria had made a critical error in leaving her documentation where I could find it, in assuming that her performance of concern had been convincing enough to blind me to her true actions. The house settled into nighttime quiet around me, full of people who had no right to be there but who slept peacefully in beds that weren't theirs. I listened to the sounds of occupation and felt my resolve harden into something unbreakable. This was my territory and I would defend it. The battle ahead would be difficult, complicated by family relationships and emotional manipulation. But I had survived building a business from nothing, had overcome obstacles and setbacks that would have defeated someone with less determination. Victoria thought she had won by establishing residency while I was too weak to resist. But she had only won the first round of a much longer fight. Tomorrow would mark the beginning of my counteroffensive, carefully planned and precisely executed. I would reclaim my home, expose the fraud that had been committed against me, and ensure that the people who had betrayed my trust faced consequences for their actions. The path ahead was clear now, illuminated by anger and determination that burned away the fog of confusion and self-doubt. I closed my eyes and focused on breathing deeply, willing my body to rest and gather strength for the challenges ahead. Sleep came eventually, not the restless, troubled sleep of recent nights but something deeper and more restorative. My subconscious mind had accepted what my conscious mind had been struggling to admit, that this was war and I needed to be ready to fight it with every resource I possessed. The woman who woke tomorrow morning would be different from the one who had arrived home from the hospital to find her sanctuary invaded. She would be focused, strategic, and absolutely unwilling to surrender what belonged to her. The early morning light would bring new challenges and the first concrete steps toward justice. But for now, I rested in the knowledge that I finally understood what I was dealing with and had begun taking action to protect myself. That understanding was power, and power was exactly what I needed to take back everything that had been stolen from me while I was too weak to defend it. Victoria would learn that underestimating someone in recovery was a profound mistake, and that physical vulnerability did not equate to helplessness or defeat. The morning of my appointment with Robert Fisher arrived with a tension that made every moment feel elongated and significant. I dressed carefully, choosing professional clothing that would present me as competent and credible rather than as the helpless invalid Victoria had been portraying me as. The effort of getting ready exhausted me more than I wanted to admit, but I refused to let physical weakness undermine the impression I needed to make. This meeting could determine whether I successfully defended my home or lost everything I had worked for. James was unusually quiet during the drive downtown, his hands tight on the steering wheel as he navigated through midday traffic. He had accepted my explanation about a follow-up medical appointment without question, but I could sense his worry about my health beneath his silence. Part of me felt guilty for the deception, for using his concern to facilitate a meeting he knew nothing about. But a larger part recognized that this was necessary, that I couldn't involve him until I had a clear understanding of my legal position and options. The law office occupied the 10th floor of a glass and steel building in the heart of downtown Austin. The reception area was tastefully decorated with modern furniture and local artwork, projecting an image of success and sophistication that helped ease some of my anxiety. A young receptionist greeted us warmly, and I asked James if he would mind waiting in the lobby while I spoke with the doctor privately. The request clearly puzzled him, but he agreed after a moment's hesitation, settling into one of the leather chairs with his phone to occupy the time. Robert Fisher met me in a private conference room with windows overlooking the city skyline. He was in his early 50s, with graying hair and an air of calm competence that immediately put me at ease. After introductions and the formalities of attorney-client privilege, I began laying out the situation in careful detail. I started with Victoria's unexpected arrival, moved through the gradual takeover of my home, and concluded with the documentation I had discovered in my office. Throughout the explanation, I pulled up photographs on my phone, showing him the evidence I had collected of her attempts to establish fraudulent residency. Robert listened without interruption, taking notes on a legal pad and occasionally asking clarifying questions. His expression remained professionally neutral, but I saw his eyebrows rise slightly when I showed him the images of the homestead exemption applications and the falsified residency documents. When I finished my explanation, he sat back in his chair and studied me for a long moment before speaking. He confirmed what I had suspected, that Victoria was indeed committing fraud by filing false residency claims and attempting to establish homestead rights at my address. The systematic nature of her documentation suggested this was premeditated rather than opportunistic, which would be relevant if criminal charges were ever pursued. However, he cautioned that proving intent and securing legal remedies would require careful strategy, particularly given the family relationships involved and my current vulnerable state that she could exploit in any dispute. Robert explained that my first priority needed to be securing my property through multiple legal channels simultaneously. He recommended filing a formal eviction notice immediately, which would start the legal clock ticking and create an official record of my opposition to their presence. He also suggested filing corrections with every government agency where Victoria had submitted false information, accompanied by sworn affidavits attesting to the fraudulent nature of her claims. Additionally, he wanted to place alerts on my property title to prevent any attempts to file liens or claims against the house without my knowledge. The comprehensive nature of his recommendations was both reassuring and overwhelming. Each action he described would create documentation and establish legal positions, but they would also escalate the conflict dramatically. There would be no maintaining family harmony once I began formal eviction proceedings against my sister-in-law. Robert acknowledged this reality, pointing out gently that the harmony I was trying to preserve was already an illusion, that Victoria had destroyed any genuine relationship when she chose to exploit my vulnerability for her own financial gain. We discussed the evidence in detail, and Robert photographed my phone screen to capture images of the documents I had found. He assured me that what I had gathered was more than sufficient to demonstrate fraud and to support my case in any legal proceeding. However, He emphasized the importance of securing original documents if possible, as photographs could potentially be challenged as altered or taken out of context. He suggested obtaining copies directly from the government agencies where Victoria had filed false information, creating an independent chain of evidence that she couldn't dispute. The question of involving law enforcement came up, and Robert's advice was pragmatic. While Victoria's actions clearly constituted fraud and possibly identity theft, pursuing criminal charges would be complicated by the family relationship and the fact that she was currently residing in my home with my husband's apparent blessing. Criminal prosecution would require cooperation from the district attorney's office, which might be reluctant to pursue charges in what they could view as a civil family dispute. He recommended focusing first on civil remedies to remove her from the property and reverse her false claims, leaving criminal options available if she refused to comply or attempted further fraudulent actions. We spent over an hour discussing strategy and timeline. Robert outlined a plan that would begin with me securing all original documents from my office, followed by filing eviction notices and government corrections simultaneously. He would draft the necessary legal documents and file them on my behalf, creating a comprehensive paper trail that would protect my interests even if Victoria attempted to escalate or retaliate. The process would take several weeks at minimum, potentially longer if she contested the eviction, but each step would strengthen my legal position and make it increasingly difficult for her to maintain her fraudulent claims. The financial aspect of legal action was significant but necessary. Robert's retainer and estimated fees for handling the case would cost several $1,000s, money I would need to draw from savings I had carefully accumulated over years. But the alternative, losing my home to Victoria's scheme, was unthinkable. I authorized him to proceed, signing the engagement agreement and providing a credit card for the retainer payment. As he processed the payment, I felt a shift in my emotional state from victim to active participant in my own defense. Before leaving, Robert offered one final piece of advice that struck me as particularly wise. He suggested that I tell James everything before serving the eviction notice, giving my husband the opportunity to understand the situation and choose his position before legal action forced him into a reactive stance. The conversation would be difficult and possibly relationship-ending, but Robert pointed out that James would inevitably discover what his sister had done once legal proceedings began. Better that he hear the truth from me in a context where I could explain my reasoning and show him the evidence than that he learn about it through served legal papers or angry phone calls from Victoria. The wisdom of this approach was undeniable, even though the thought of that conversation filled me with dread. I thanked Robert for his counsel and his willingness to take my case. He walked me back to the reception area, where James stood immediately upon seeing me, concern evident in his posture and expression. I introduced the two men vaguely as a legal consultant I had needed to speak with regarding some property matters, and James accepted the explanation though I could see questions forming behind his eyes. The drive home was heavier with unspoken tension. James asked how the appointment had gone, and I told him truthfully that it had been productive and informative. He didn't press for details, perhaps sensing that I wasn't ready to discuss whatever had transpired in that conference room. The silence between us felt charged with all the conversations we weren't having, all the truths I was holding back until I could figure out how to reveal them without destroying everything. Back at the house, Victoria greeted us at the door with her usual performance of concerned helpfulness. She asked about my appointment, and I gave the same vague responses I had given James. I could see her calculating behind her pleasant expression, trying to determine if there was any threat to her plans in my afternoon absence. For the first time since discovering her fraud, I felt a small sense of power in knowing something she didn't, in understanding that her scheme had been exposed even if she didn't yet realize it. That evening, I waited until the house had settled into its nighttime routine. The children were in their rooms, Margaret had retired early, and Derek was watching television in the living room. Victoria was in my office again, conducting whatever business occupied her hours behind that closed door. I asked James if we could talk privately, and something in my tone made him set down his phone immediately and follow me to our bedroom with a seriousness that suggested he knew this conversation would be significant. I sat on the edge of the bed and tried to find the right words to begin. How do you tell your husband that his beloved sister is committing fraud against you? How do you reveal a betrayal so calculated and systematic that it seems almost unbelievable? I started with the simplest statement I could manage, telling him that I needed to show him something I had discovered, and that it was going to be difficult for him to hear but necessary for him to understand. James sat beside me, his face already showing the defensive posture that people adopt when they sense criticism of someone they love is coming. I pulled out my phone and began walking him through the evidence methodically, starting with the photographs of the residency documents and moving through the homestead applications, the bank statements using my address, and finally the medical records with Victoria's calculations about my recovery timeline. I explained what each document meant, how they fit together into a comprehensive scheme to establish false residency and potentially claim rights to my property. His initial reaction was denial, exactly as I had anticipated. He suggested there must be some misunderstanding, that perhaps Victoria had made innocent mistakes in filling out forms while she was stressed about helping with my care. I gently but firmly pointed out that the volume and consistency of the documentation made innocent error impossible, that this level of systematic fraud required deliberate planning and execution. I showed him the notes in Victoria's handwriting, the timeline she had created around my surgery, the evidence that this had been calculated to exploit my vulnerability. The color drained from James's face as the reality began to penetrate his defenses. He took my phone and scrolled through the images himself, studying each one with growing horror. I could see the moment when belief finally overcame denial, when he had to accept that his sister had indeed done what I was describing. His hands began to shake, and he set the phone down carefully as if it had become too heavy to hold. The silence that followed was profound and painful. James stood and walked to the window, staring out at the darkened street below. I watched the tension in his shoulders, the way his hands clenched and unclenched at his sides, and I knew he was struggling with the collision between his lifetime of trust in Victoria and the undeniable evidence of her betrayal. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough with emotion, asking why she would do this, what she possibly had to gain by stealing from her own family. I explained what I had pieced together about their financial situation, about the likelihood that they were facing serious consequences from debt or business failures. I suggested that establishing residency in Texas, particularly at my address with its favorable homestead protections, could shield assets from creditors or provide legal advantages in bankruptcy proceedings. I was gentle in my explanation, trying to give him information without making him feel responsible for his sister's choices, but I could see each word landing like a blow. James turned from the window and asked what I planned to do. The question held so much weight, so many implications about our future and our marriage. I told him about my meeting with Robert Fisher, about the legal strategy we had discussed, about the necessity of filing eviction notices, and correcting the fraudulent claims Victoria had made. I explained that I had no choice but to protect my property and my rights, that allowing this to continue would result in losing everything I had worked for. What I was really asking, though neither of us stated it explicitly, was whether he would support me or his sister when this conflict became public and unavoidable. James seemed to understand the unspoken question beneath my explanation. He returned to the bed and took my hands in his grip tight and desperate. He said he needed time to think, to process what he had learned, but that he understood why I had to take action. He didn't promise to support me against his family, but he didn't try to talk me out of pursuing legal remedies either. It was the most I could hope for given the circumstances. We talked late into the night, going over details and discussing options. James asked if there was any way to resolve this privately, without lawyers and legal proceedings, and I explained that Victoria's actions had already crossed legal boundaries that couldn't be undone through family conversations. The false residency claims were now in government systems, creating records that would affect my property rights and tax obligations. Simply asking her to leave wouldn't reverse the damage she had already done to my legal standing. Sometime after midnight, we finally turned off the lights and lay in the darkness side by side. Neither of us could sleep, the weight of what we had discussed hanging heavy in the air between us. I could hear James breathing, quick and shallow, as he wrestled with the destruction of his understanding of his family and his place in it. I lay still, my mind already moving forward to the practical steps I would need to take in the coming days, the confrontations that would inevitably follow once legal documents were served. The next morning arrived gray and overcast, the weather matching the oppressive atmosphere in the house. I had made my decision during the sleepless hours of the night. Today, I would secure the original documents from my office before Victoria had a chance to destroy them. Tomorrow, Robert would file the eviction notices and begin the process of correcting the fraudulent residency claims. And then whatever happened would happen. I was done being passive, done accepting violation in the name of family harmony. Victoria must have sensed something had shifted, because her demeanor at breakfast was more watchful than usual. She asked James if everything was okay, noting that he seemed quiet and distracted. He mumbled something about work stress and avoided meeting her eyes. Margaret tried to fill the awkward silence with chatter about her plans for the day, but even she seemed to feel the tension that had settled over the household like a suffocating blanket. I waited until Victoria left for one of her errands, taking Derek and the children with her for what she announced would be a few hours of shopping. The moment their car disappeared down the street, I moved into action. James helped me, his assistance a silent statement of where his loyalties ultimately lay. We carefully documented the exact position of every item in my office, then systematically went through all the files and folders Victoria had accumulated. We found even more evidence than I had initially discovered. Hidden beneath other papers were draft legal documents attempting to add Victoria as a co-owner of my property, applications for lines of credit using my house as collateral, and correspondence with attorneys about options for establishing permanent residency rights. The scope of her scheme was breathtaking in its ambition and its callousness. She hadn't been planning to simply stay temporarily. She had been working toward permanently appropriating my home, using legal mechanisms and my temporary vulnerability to accomplish a theft that would have been complete before I even understood what was happening. James's face grew progressively darker as we uncovered each new layer of Victoria's planning. At one point he had to step away, his anger and grief overwhelming his ability to continue. I heard him in the kitchen, his fist hitting the counter with impotent rage. When he returned, his eyes were red but his jaw was set with determination. He told me he would support whatever actions I needed to take, that he was sorry for not seeing what was happening, and that he would stand with me against anyone who tried to prevent justice. Those words meant more than I could express. Whatever happened in the coming days, whatever family relationships were destroyed by the truth emerging, I wouldn't be facing it alone. James had chosen me over his sister, had chosen truth over comfortable denial. It didn't erase the pain of betrayal or the violation I had experienced, but it provided a foundation of support that made the path forward feel less impossible. We secured all the documents in a locked safe that Victoria didn't know existed, hidden in our bedroom closet. I photographed everything before storing it, creating digital backups that I uploaded to secure cloud storage. By the time Victoria and her family returned from their shopping expedition, the office looked exactly as they had left it, with only subtle differences in document positioning that wouldn't be noticeable unless someone was specifically looking for evidence of disturbance. That evening, Robert Fisher called to inform me that all the legal documents had been prepared and would be filed with the court first thing the following morning. The eviction notice would be served by a professional process server, ensuring proper legal procedure. Simultaneously, corrections would be filed with every government agency where Victoria had submitted false information, accompanied by my sworn affidavits and supporting documentation. The coordinated approach would make it clear that this was serious legal action, not family drama that could be negotiated away. I thanked him for his swift work and confirmed that I was ready to proceed. After ending the call, I sat with James in our bedroom and we discussed what would happen next. The legal proceedings would trigger confrontation and chaos. Victoria would likely respond with anger and accusations, portraying herself as the victim of my paranoia or ingratitude. Margaret would defend her daughter, and the extended family would be drawn into taking sides. Our lives would become exponentially more complicated and stressful, at precisely the time when I most needed peace and rest for my continued recovery. But the alternative was surrender, accepting that everything I had built could be stolen by someone willing to exploit family relationships and temporary vulnerability. That alternative was unacceptable. I had worked too hard, sacrificed too much, and valued my independence too deeply to let it be taken without fighting back with every legal tool available. If that fight destroyed family relationships, then those relationships were built on a foundation too weak to deserve preservation. We went through the house that night in a kind of farewell tour, knowing that tomorrow everything would change irrevocably. The living room where Victoria currently held court would become a battlefield. The kitchen where Margaret tried to establish control would be reclaimed. The office where fraud had been planned and executed would be cleared of all traces of invasion. Every room that had been appropriated would be restored to its rightful owner, legally and physically. James and I stood together on the back porch in the cool night air, looking at the garden I had planted and tended over the years. The native Texas plants swayed in the breeze, resilient and adapted to survive in challenging conditions. I felt a kinship with those plants, recognizing that survival sometimes requires deep roots and the ability to weather storms that would uproot weaker specimens. My roots in this property, in this life I had built, went deep enough to withstand whatever Victoria could throw at me. Tomorrow the process server would arrive, and the careful facade Victoria had constructed would shatter. She would learn that I had discovered her scheme, that I had documented everything, and that I was prepared to use the full force of the law to defend what belonged to me. The confrontation would be ugly and painful, but it was necessary and long overdue. Sometimes the only way to restore peace is to first acknowledge and address the war that has been quietly waged against you. I slept better that night than I had in weeks, not because the situation was resolved, but because I had finally stopped being a passive victim and had become an active defender of my rights and my property. The fear and confusion that had dominated my emotional state since Victoria's arrival had been replaced by clarity and determination. Whatever happened next, I would face it with the knowledge that I had done everything possible to protect what was mine, and that I had the support of the one person whose support truly mattered. The morning sun would bring justice, confrontation, and the beginning of restoration. But for now, I rested in the knowledge that tomorrow would mark the end of my displacement and the beginning of Victoria's reckoning. The process server arrived at 9:30 in the morning, a professional woman in business attire carrying a leather portfolio. I watched from the upstairs window as she approached the front door, her posture confident and purposeful. James had stayed home from work, positioning himself in the living room where he could observe but not interfere. The doorbell rang and I heard Margaret's voice calling out that she would get it, her tone cheerful and unsuspecting of what was about to unfold. The conversation at the door was brief and formal. The process server identified herself and asked for Victoria Brennan. Margaret's confusion was audible even from upstairs, her voice rising with questions about who was asking and why. Victoria appeared from my office, and I heard her confident assertion that she was Victoria Brennan. Then silence, followed by the rustle of papers and the process server's practiced explanation that Victoria was being served with legal documents that required her attention and response. Victoria's voice when she finally spoke was sharp with disbelief. She demanded to know what this was about, who had sent these papers, why someone was serving her legal documents at her sister-in-law's house. The process server responded with professional detachment, explaining that the documents were self-explanatory, and that Victoria should consult with an attorney if she had questions. Then footsteps retreating down the walkway, a car door closing, and an engine starting. The process server's job was complete. The explosion of sound that followed was immediate and volcanic. Victoria's voice rose to a scream, calling my name with a fury that made the windows rattle. Margaret joined in with bewildered questions, demanding to know what was happening. I heard James's calmer voice attempting to interject, but he was drowned out by Victoria's rage. I took a deep breath, steadied myself against the dresser, and made my way downstairs to face the confrontation I had known was inevitable. Victoria stood in the entryway clutching the legal documents, her face flushed red with anger and her hands shaking. Margaret hovered beside her, reading over her shoulder with an expression of growing horror. Derek had emerged from wherever he had been, and the children were peering around the corner with wide eyes, sensing that something significant was happening but not understanding what. When Victoria saw me descending the stairs, she thrust the papers toward me like a weapon. She demanded an explanation, her voice raw with accusation. How dare I serve her with eviction papers after everything she had done to help me? How could I be so ungrateful, so paranoid, so cruel to family who had sacrificed their time and comfort to care for me during my recovery? Margaret echoed her daughter's sentiments, her voice quavering with hurt and confusion. They had only been trying to help, she insisted. This was how I repaid their kindness and concern. I reached the bottom of the stairs and stood facing them, my voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through my system. I told Victoria that I knew exactly what she had been doing, that I had found all the documents in my office, that I had evidence of every fraudulent residency claim she had filed. I watched her expression shift from outrage to calculation as she realized the full extent of what I had discovered. The color drained from her face, replaced by a pallor that made her look suddenly older and far less confident. She attempted to deny everything, her words tumbling over each other in a desperate rush to construct some plausible explanation. The documents were just precautionary measures, she claimed, in case something happened to me during recovery and James needed family support in managing the property. She had only been trying to protect the family's interests, to ensure continuity of care if my health took a turn for the worse. The lies were transparent and insulting, treating me as if I were too stupid to understand what I had seen with my own eyes. James stepped forward then, his voice cutting through Victoria's explanations with cold precision. He told her to stop lying, that he had seen the evidence himself, that there was no innocent explanation for attempting to establish homestead rights at someone else's address or applying for credit using property you didn't own. Victoria turned on her brother with a look of betrayal, asking how he could take my side against his own family. James's response was quiet but firm, pointing out that I was his family, and that Victoria had betrayed that family by attempting to steal from us. The argument devolved into shouting, accusations flying between siblings while Margaret tried ineffectively to mediate. Derek pulled the children away from the scene, ushering them toward the guest room and closing the door against the adult chaos. I stood apart from the conflict, watching the family dynamics I had married into reveal themselves in their rawest form. Victoria's mask of competent concern had shattered completely, exposing the desperation and calculation underneath. Margaret's enabling became more obvious, as she continued trying to minimize Victoria's actions while condemning my response to them. Eventually the shouting exhausted itself into tense silence. Victoria stood with tears streaming down her face, no longer angry but visibly frightened about the legal consequences she was facing. Margaret had retreated to the sofa, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue and looking between her children with anguish. James remained standing beside me, his physical proximity a statement of alliance that Victoria understood perfectly. The family structure she had relied upon all her life, the assumption that blood loyalty would trump all other considerations, had failed her at the critical moment. I spoke then, my voice carrying clearly through the charged atmosphere. I explained that the eviction notice gave them 72 hours to vacate my property, and that I expected them to be gone within that time frame. I informed them that I had also filed corrections with every government agency where Victoria had submitted false information, and that those agencies might pursue their own investigations into the fraud. I made clear that if they attempted to remain beyond the legal deadline, or if they caused any damage to the property during their departure, I would not hesitate to involve law enforcement. Victoria asked in a broken voice what would happen to her, where her family was supposed to go. I responded that those were questions she should have considered before committing fraud against someone who had welcomed her into their home. Her financial problems, whatever they were, did not justify stealing from family or exploiting someone's medical vulnerability. The consequences she was facing now were the direct result of choices she had made, and I would not sacrifice my home and my security to shield her from those consequences. Margaret made one final attempt to appeal to my sympathy, reminding me that Victoria had children who would be affected by this upheaval. I acknowledged that the situation was unfortunate for Sophie and Ethan, but pointed out that their mother had created this circumstance through her own actions. Protecting children sometimes means holding their parents accountable for behavior that puts the family at risk. Victoria had gambled her children's stability on a fraudulent scheme, and she alone bore responsibility for the outcome. The next 72 hours passed in a strange limbo of coexistence. Victoria and her family moved through the house like ghosts, packing their belongings in an atmosphere of bitter resentment. Margaret barely spoke to me, her disappointment and anger radiating from every stiff gesture. Derek handled the logistics of their departure with grim efficiency, making arrangements for an extended stay hotel, while they figured out their next steps. The children were confused and upset, old enough to sense the severity of what was happening, but not old enough to fully understand the adult complications that had created it. James took a few days off work to ensure the move-out happened according to the legal timeline and without incident. His presence was both support and insurance, making clear that he stood with me, and that any attempts to delay or sabotage would be met with immediate consequences. Victoria barely looked at him during those final days, her sense of betrayal by her brother apparently even deeper than her anger at me. The sibling relationship they had shared for decades was fundamentally altered, possibly destroyed, by the collision of his loyalty to me and her fury at being held accountable. On the final day, I watched from the upstairs window as they loaded the last boxes into their vehicles. The driveway that had been crowded with their cars for weeks was finally clearing. Margaret cast one last look at the house before getting into Derek's SUV, her expression a mixture of sorrow and accusation. Victoria didn't look back at all, her focus entirely on getting her children settled in the car and escaping the scene of her failed scheme. When they were gone, the house felt both empty and liberated. James and I walked through each room, surveying the damage and displacement that remained. Furniture would need to be returned to its original positions, my office would require complete reorganization, and the general sense of violation would take time to fade. But the house was ours again, legally and emotionally. The invasion had been repelled, and the sanctuary I had built was being restored. In the weeks that followed, I learned through James that Victoria and Derek had indeed been facing bankruptcy, and that my property had been intended as a shelter for assets they were trying to protect from creditors. The scheme had been even more calculated than I had realized, with Victoria researching Texas homestead laws specifically to exploit protections designed for legitimate residents. Her desperation had driven her to betray family bonds and exploit my medical vulnerability, gambling that I would be too weak or too conditioned to family harmony to effectively resist. Robert Fisher helped me complete the process of clearing all fraudulent claims from government records, a tedious but necessary task that took several months to fully resolve. Each correction was documented and filed, creating a comprehensive record that would protect me if Victoria ever attempted to resurface with additional false claims. The legal fees were substantial, but they represented an investment in my security and independence that was worth every dollar. My relationship with James survived, strengthened paradoxically by the crisis that could have destroyed it. He had been forced to choose between comfortable denial and difficult truth, and he had chosen truth even when it meant acknowledging painful realities about his family. We worked together to restore the house and to establish stronger boundaries around our shared life, learning from the experience that family loyalty must be balanced against personal integrity and mutual respect. The house gradually returned to the peaceful sanctuary I had originally created, but I was changed by what had happened. I had learned that vulnerability invites exploitation from unexpected sources, that family relationships can mask calculated predation, and that defending what is yours sometimes requires confrontation that destroys the illusion of harmony. But I had also learned that I possessed strength I hadn't recognized, that strategic thinking could overcome physical weakness, and that justice was possible even when the violation came from those closest to you. Standing on my porch in the evening light, looking at the garden I had planted and the home I had defended, I felt a profound sense of ownership that went beyond legal title. This was mine because I had built it, had protected it, and had refused to surrender it even when doing so would have been easier than fighting. The experience had cost me in family relationships and emotional energy, but it had given me something more valuable in clarity about my own worth and my willingness to defend what I had earned. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.